What happened when you risked your life for a stranger? This woman, Naomi, approached me at the coffee shop where I was working on my laptop and slipped me $300 to sit at a nearby table while she broke up with her boyfriend, Jeremy. She said she needed a witness in case things went bad because Jeremy had a temper and she was scared to do it alone. Naomi explained that Jeremy had never hit her, but he'd punched walls, thrown phones, and once drove his car through his ex's garage door when she'd ended things. She'd been trying to leave for months, but every time she tried, he'd explode and she'd back down. She picked this restaurant because it was public enough that he couldn't completely lose it, but quiet enough that I could intervene if needed. All I had to do was sit one table over, pretend to work on my laptop, and call 911 if Jeremy got violent. He'd completely alienated her from all her friends, so there was no one else she could ask. She promised he'd be there at noon, and it would be over by 12:30. I needed the money and figured nothing too bad could happen in a crowded restaurant. Jeremy arrived 5 minutes late. He was bigger than I expected, the kind of guy who had veins visible in his forehead even when calm. He kissed Naomi, and she turned her cheek, the first sign something was wrong. I opened my laptop and pretended to type while positioning myself so I could see them in my screen's reflection. Naomi started talking in this measured voice she'd probably practiced 100 times, and my stomach tightened knowing what was coming. At first, Jeremy laughed like she was joking, but when she kept going, his smile froze, then disappeared completely. He reached across the table and grabbed her wrist, not hard enough to make her cry out, but I could see her hand turning red. "You're not serious," he said, loud enough that the couple next to them looked over. Naomi pulled her hand back and kept talking, saying something about different paths, and Jeremy's jaw started doing this twitching thing. I found myself gripping my phone harder, ready to move if he grabbed her again. The waiter came to take their order, and Jeremy ordered for both of them without asking her, his voice totally normal like they weren't in the middle of a breakup. The fake normalcy made my skin crawl because I could see his knuckles were white where he gripped the menu. As soon as the waiter left, he leaned forward and started talking fast and low, and I could only catch pieces. 3 years, everything I've done, you can't just... His hands were moving wildly, and he knocked over the salt shaker, then the pepper, then his water glass. The busboy rushed over to clean up, and Jeremy smiled at him, thanked him, then went right back to that intense whisper. The rapid mood switch scared me more than if he'd just stayed angry. Naomi tried to stand up, but Jeremy grabbed her arm and pulled her back down, still smiling like they were having a normal conversation. My phone was already in my hand with 911 pre-dialed, my thumb hovering over the call button. Part of me wanted to intervene right then, or just get the hell out of there, but I kept thinking about the $300 and how Naomi had specifically said to wait unless he got violent. But watching her trapped there, trying to leave while he held her purse, made me feel like a coward for not stepping in. Jeremy was getting louder now, saying, "Who is he? Just tell me who he is," over and over, while Naomi kept saying there was nobody else. Jeremy stood up suddenly, and his chair fell backward with a crash that made everyone jump, including me. He picked it up, laughing, apologizing to the room, then sat back down and grabbed both of Naomi's hands across the table. To anyone watching, it might have looked romantic, but I could see her trying to pull away and him not letting go. My whole body was tense, ready to spring up, but I kept remembering Naomi's instructions to stay invisible unless absolutely necessary. "We're going to work this out," he said, louder now, "because you love me and I love you, and that's what people who love each other do." The manager started walking over, but Jeremy saw him coming and let go of Naomi's hands, putting his palms up like he was surrendering. Sorry, just having a passionate discussion with my girlfriend," he said, and the manager hesitated. That's when Naomi said clearly, "I'm not your girlfriend anymore," and Jeremy's face went completely blank, like she'd hit a switch. He stood up slowly this time, deliberately, and walked around to Naomi's side of the table. She pressed herself against the wall as he leaned down to whisper something in her ear, his hand on the back of her chair, trapping her. I started to stand because this was it. This was the moment I was supposed to protect her, but he must have sensed the movement because his head snapped up and he looked right at me. Not a glance, but a real look, like he was memorizing my face. My blood went cold. "You need something?" he asked me, his voice weirdly calm. I said no, just stretching, and sat back down, but he kept staring. Then he looked at Naomi, back at me, and I saw it click in his eyes. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it as he walked over to my table slowly, both hands visible, but somehow that made it worse. He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down like we were old friends about to catch up. "You're with her, aren't you?" he said quietly, leaning forward. "She hired you to watch this, to protect her from me." His hands were flat on the table between us, and I could see them trembling with controlled rage. Behind him, Naomi was frantically shaking her head at me, tears running down her face, mouthing the word, "Run." My throat went completely dry as Jeremy's hands stayed flat on the table between us, the trembling in his fingers the only sign of the rage he was barely keeping under control. I forced myself to meet his eyes, even though every part of me wanted to look away, wanted to run like Naomi was mouthing at me from behind his shoulder. "I don't know what you're talking about," I managed to say, trying to keep my voice steady, even though my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. Jeremy didn't move, didn't blink, just kept staring at me with those cold eyes while his jaw twitched like he was grinding his teeth. "I'm just here working on my laptop," I continued, gesturing at my screen where I'd been pretending to type this whole time. He leaned forward slightly to look at my screen, studying the random document I'd opened, then his eyes moved back to my face like he was trying to read my mind. The silence stretched out forever while he weighed whether to believe me, his breathing getting heavier through his nose. Behind him, I could see Naomi trying to edge toward the exit, moving slowly like she thought if she went slow enough, Jeremy wouldn't notice. But without even turning around, Jeremy shifted his body to the left, blocking her path with his bulk. She froze against the wall of the booth, trapped between him and the wooden divider, her eyes wide with panic. The couple at the next table had stopped eating completely and were openly staring at us now, the woman holding her phone like she wasn't sure if she should call someone. I knew I had to do something to break the tension before Jeremy exploded, so I reached for my water glass with a shaking hand and deliberately knocked it off the table. The glass hit the floor and shattered, sending ice and water spraying across the tiles in every direction. Everyone in that section of the restaurant jumped at the crash, including Jeremy, who finally broke eye contact with me to look look at the mess. The waiter and busboy came rushing over with towels and a mop, forcing Jeremy to step back from my table to let them clean up. This gave Naomi a few feet of space, and I saw her take a deep breath like she'd been holding it the whole time. The manager appeared from the back office, probably alerted by the crash, and walked over to our corner, asking if everything was all right. While he was talking to the waiter about the broken glass, I slipped my phone under the table and dialed 911, keeping the line open without saying anything. I figured if things got worse, they could trace the call, or at least hear what was happening, and my thumb stayed ready over the speaker button in case I needed them to hear clearly. Jeremy immediately switched into a completely different person when the manager turned to him, smiling and apologizing about the lover's spat with his girlfriend. "We're just working through some things," he said, in this smooth voice that made my skin crawl because I'd seen his real face just seconds before. He put his arm around Naomi's shoulders and pulled her against him, and she went completely rigid but didn't pull away, probably too scared of what he'd do if she embarrassed him in front of the manager. The manager looked between them uncertainly, clearly sensing something was wrong, but not seeing any actual violence to justify getting involved. I noticed several other customers had their phones out now, and at least 2 people at different tables were definitely recording what was happening. Jeremy must have noticed them too, because his fake smile faltered for just a second, and I saw pure fury flash across his face before the mask went back up. He knew he was watched and documented, knew that whatever he did next would be on video, and that seemed to be the only thing keeping him from completely losing it. The manager cleared his throat and said quietly, but firmly, that he was going to have to ask both of them to leave since they were disturbing the other customers. Jeremy started to argue, saying they hadn't done anything wrong, but the manager cut him off and mentioned he could call the police if needed. That shut Jeremy up real quick, and he let go of Naomi, standing up and straightening his shirt like he was about to leave. He walked toward the door but stopped right next to my table, looking down at me for 3 long seconds without saying anything. I wonder what's really going through Jeremy's head when he can switch from rage to charm so fast with the manager. This whole fake smile thing while his knuckles are white makes me curious about how many times he's done this before in public places, playing the normal boyfriend while barely holding back his anger. His eyes promised this wasn't over, that he knew I'd lied to him, that he'd remember my face. Then he walked out, the little bell above the door ringing as he left. The second he was gone, Naomi started shaking like she'd been holding it all in and now couldn't stop. She sat down hard in the nearest chair and put her head in her hands, and that's when she realized Jeremy still had her car keys from when she'd let him drive to dinner last week. The waiter brought her some water while another staff member kept watch at the window to make sure Jeremy wasn't coming back. I walked over and tried to give her the $300 back, telling her she should keep it since this hadn't exactly gone as planned, but she pushed the money away. "You earned it," she said, her voice shaking as bad as her hands. "And you might need it for what comes next because he saw your face and he doesn't forget things like this." The staff helped her call a locksmith while I sat with her, both of us jumping every time the door opened. About 20 minutes later, 2 police officers showed up to take our statements, but they seemed frustrated when we explained what had happened. "So he didn't actually hit anyone?" one of them asked, like that was the only thing that mattered. They explained that threatening looks and blocking someone's path didn't meet the threshold for arrest, that without actual violence or explicit threats, there wasn't much they could do. They took down Jeremy's information and suggested Naomi file for a restraining order, but even that would take time and wouldn't guarantee her safety in the meantime. I pulled out my phone and typed my number into Naomi's contacts while she did the same with mine. She kept saying sorry over and over, her hands shaking as she typed. "Jeremy knows where I live and where I work," she said, looking around the parking lot like he might pop out from behind a car. I told her to text me when she got home safe, already feeling that sick feeling in my stomach about what I'd gotten myself into. The cop who'd taken our statements walked over with some papers and handed us each a bunch of pamphlets about protective orders and safety planning. He explained the whole process in this tired voice like he'd given this speech 1,000 times before. "Look, I'm gonna be straight with you," he said, tapping the restraining order pamphlet. "These are just pieces of paper and they won't physically stop someone who's determined to hurt you." Naomi's face went white at that, and she looked like she might throw up. Walking home that evening, I kept checking behind me every few steps. My phone buzzed with a voicemail notification from a blocked number, and I almost dropped it. The voice was calm and friendly, which made it worse. "Hey there, I think we should talk about that misunderstanding at the restaurant today," the voice said. "I know you were just doing what you were paid to do. No hard feelings." My stomach dropped straight through the sidewalk, because it was Jeremy, and somehow he'd gotten my phone number. I practically ran the rest of the way home and locked my door behind me. That night I sat at my computer and started typing up everything that had happened, every single detail I could remember. The exact time Jeremy arrived, what he said, how he grabbed Naomi's wrist, when he knocked over the water glass, everything. I created a shared folder on Google Drive and sent Naomi the link so we could both add stuff to it. My hands were shaking as I typed, and I kept seeing Jeremy's face when he figured out I was there to watch them. Around 2 in the morning, my phone lit up with a text from Naomi. "He's parked outside my building right now," she wrote. "I'm sitting in my car at a gas station too scared to go home." I told her to call the cops and ask for an escort home, but she texted back that she already tried. They told her he wasn't breaking any laws by sitting on a public street. The next morning, I went to my shift at the coffee shop, and my manager pulled me aside. "Weirdest thing," she said. "Got a reference check call about you yesterday from someone claiming to be a former employer." She explained the caller asked all these personal questions about my schedule and when I usually worked and if I had any regular customers. We both knew it was Jeremy trying to figure out where to find me. 2 days later, Naomi and I met at the courthouse to file for a temporary restraining order. The place was packed with people filling out forms and looking stressed. I wrote out my witness statement about what I saw at the restaurant, while Naomi filled out page after page about all the times Jeremy had scared her or made her feel unsafe. The clerk behind the window took our papers and said a judge would look at them within 48 hours. 48 hours felt like forever when you're looking over your shoulder every 5 seconds. That evening, I went to my usual coffee shop to work on my laptop like always, trying to pretend everything was normal. I'd been there about an hour when Jeremy walked in and sat at a table across the room. He didn't order anything, just sat there staring at me. I pulled out my phone and started recording him, and the second he saw what I was doing, he stood up and walked out. out. The barista came over and asked if I was okay, and that's when I realized my whole body was shaking. A detective called the next day to follow up on our reports. He explained that without actual threats of violence or Jeremy making physical contact with us, there wasn't much they could do criminally. Document everything and call 911 if he approaches either of you, he said, like that was supposed to make us feel better. The gap between what felt dangerous and what the law considered dangerous was huge. A few days later, a woman from a local nonprofit called Naomi and offered to meet with both of us. She was a domestic violence advocate and the first person who seemed to actually get how scary this whole thing was. She helped us make safety plans, showed us how to vary our routes to work, change up our schedules, check our cars for tracking devices. This kind of constant vigilance is exhausting, she said, and I wanted to cry because finally someone understood. She gave us both these little personal alarms and showed us how to share our locations with trusted friends. The advocate explained that stalkers often escalate their behavior when they feel like they're losing control, which meant things might get worse before they got better. She had us practice scenarios, like what to do if Jeremy showed up at our workplace or followed us in a car. Every day felt like walking through a minefield, never knowing when he might appear. My phone started buzzing with unknown numbers that same night. First 1 or 2, then 5, then 20 in an hour. I'd block one number and 3 more would call immediately. Most calls hung up after one ring, but a few left voicemails of just breathing or static. One message was different though. Just someone saying my name 3 times real slow before the line went dead. My hands shook as I played it back because I knew it was Jeremy, even though the voice was muffled. The phone company said they couldn't block all unknown numbers without also blocking legitimate calls like doctor's offices or delivery drivers. I downloaded every blocking app I could find, but the calls kept coming through different numbers, sometimes at 3 in the morning, sometimes while I was trying to work. Naomi called me crying 2 days later because she'd made a mistake and answered one of Jeremy's calls. He'd been sobbing on the phone, saying he'd already signed up for anger management and therapy, that he just needed one more chance to prove he'd changed. She hung up when his voice shifted from crying to yelling about how she was ruining his life. But now her phone was blowing up with texts about mixed signals and leading him on. I wanted to tell her she shouldn't have answered, but remembered what the advocate said about how abusers use hope as a weapon. That weekend I went to the electronics store and bought the cheapest security camera they had for my apartment door. My upstairs neighbor Lysander Stowe saw me trying to install it and came down with his drill to help. While we worked, he mentioned seeing a dark sedan circle our block 4 times yesterday morning, slow enough that he noticed, but fast enough that it didn't seem suspicious to anyone not paying attention. He offered to text me if he saw it again, and having someone else watching made the knot in my chest loosen just a little. Monday morning, I walked out to my car and found 3 thin scratches running down the driver's side door, 2 straight and even to be accidental but shallow enough that insurance would call it normal wear. The parking lot didn't have cameras, and nobody saw anything happen overnight. The police officer took photos and filled out a report, but said without proof of who did it or when, there was nothing they could pursue. I knew it was Jeremy, but knowing and proving were 2 different things. 3 days later, I was grabbing milk at the grocery store when someone bumped into me hard enough to knock items out of my basket. Jeremy was all apologies and smiles, helping me pick things up while other shoppers walked around us. But when he handed me my bread, his fingers wrapped around my wrist, and he leaned in close enough that I could smell his cologne. His voice dropped to almost nothing as he said I should mind my own business and stop filling Naomi's head with lies. I fumbled for my phone, but by the time I got the camera open, he was already at the end of the aisle, turning back to wave at me with this huge, friendly smile. The whole thing took maybe 30 seconds, but my legs were shaking so bad I had to lean against the dairy case. The next week, Naomi finally got her day in court for the protective order, and the judge granted it immediately after seeing our documentation. Jeremy's playing stalker bingo and hitting every square. Mysterious calls, car scratches, grocery store accidents. Someone tell this guy Netflix already has enough true crime content without his amateur hour contributions. Jeremy had to stay 500 feet away from her home, work, and anywhere else she regularly went. But the order was just paper until it got served on him, and suddenly Jeremy became impossible to find. The process server went to his apartment 3 times, but he never answered even though his car was there. They tried his gym, his favorite bar, even waited outside his job, but he always managed to slip away or just not show up. Each failed attempt cost Naomi another $100 and meant another day the order wasn't active. She couldn't go to work because he might be there waiting, and she was burning through sick days fast. 3 days of this, and she was ready to give up because the law said he had to be properly served, meaning he basically controlled when the protection would start. My manager at the coffee shop, Amy Stratton, noticed me checking the door every time it opened and quietly switched all my shifts to daytime only. She had me working in the back office doing inventory instead of at the register where anyone could see me. When I tried to explain why, she just asked for Jeremy's photo and said she'd share it with all the staff. I typed up a safety plan, listing his car make and license plate, his description, and what to do if he showed up. Every employee got a copy, and Amy posted one by each register. I was grateful, but also embarrassed that my problems were affecting everyone else's work environment. Then my boss, Adora Thayer, called me into her office looking confused and concerned. Someone claiming to be my former landlord had called saying I'd skipped out on 3 months' rent and caused thousands in property damage. The caller said I was violent and unstable, that I'd threatened other tenants and shouldn't be trusted around customers. Adora knew it was lies because she'd been my reference when I got my current apartment, but now I had to defend myself and worry whether other places Jeremy called would be so understanding. Naomi tried reaching out to friends for a place to stay, but realized how few she had left after 3 years of Jeremy slowly cutting her off from everyone. One co-worker offered their couch, but backed out after their roommate said they didn't want to get involved in drama that might follow Naomi to their home. The advocate explained this was typical, that abusers deliberately isolate their victims so they have nowhere to turn when they try to leave. Officer Bennett Thorne showed up at my apartment the next day with a thick folder and a worn notebook. He sat at my kitchen table and spread out forms I'd never seen before, pointing to each section with his pen. He showed me how to write down every single thing that happened with dates, times, and exact words if I remembered remembered them. His hands moved across the papers as he explained which details mattered most for court and which ones wouldn't help. He pulled out his phone and showed me how to take photos that would actually be useful as evidence. The timestamp had to be visible, and I needed to get wide shots showing the whole scene, not just close-ups. He made me practice taking photos of my door and windows from different angles until I got it right. He told me the system moved like molasses, but said every piece of paper we filed made the case stronger. Having one cop who actually gave a damn made things feel slightly less hopeless. 3 nights later, my phone buzzed with a text from Naomi at 3:17 a.m. She'd woken up to a weird feeling and looked out her window to see Jeremy standing on the sidewalk below. He was just standing there in the dark looking up at her apartment, not moving at all. She sent me a video she took with her phone, and I could see his figure under the streetlight, completely still like a statue. She called 911 while I watched him through her video feed, neither of us speaking as we waited. The cops took 43 minutes to show up, and by then, Jeremy was long gone. Officer Thorne reviewed the footage the next morning, but said Jeremy had been smart enough to stay on public property. Standing on a sidewalk wasn't illegal, even if it was creepy as hell at 3 in the morning. I started building a timeline on my laptop, creating a document that grew longer every day. Screenshots of texts went in one folder, videos in another, and I typed out every incident with as much detail as I could remember. The file got so big, I had to buy more cloud storage to keep it all organized. Every photo, every message, every police report number went into my growing collection of evidence. The organization gave me something to focus on when everything else felt out of control. A week later, I found a subpoena in my mailbox requiring me to testify at the protective order hearing. My hands shook as I read through the legal language that basically said I had to show up or face consequences. The date was circled in red ink, and my stomach turned thinking about sitting in the same room as Jeremy. Alara Swift called me that afternoon and warned me Jeremy would probably have a lawyer. She said the lawyer would try to make me look unreliable or suggest I was making things up for attention. That same evening, I got a Facebook message from someone named Adora, who said she was Jeremy's ex from 3 years ago. She sent photos of her garage door with a huge hole smashed through it, where Jeremy had driven his car straight through. Police reports from back then showed she'd filed multiple complaints before the garage incident. She told me he always got worse when cops or courts got involved because it made him feel cornered. Her story matched ours so closely it made my skin crawl. Naomi called me crying at 2 a.m. a few nights later, apologizing over and over for dragging me into this mess. I could hear her hyperventilating through the phone, and it took 20 minutes to calm her down. I finally had to tell her I couldn't handle the middle of the night crisis calls anymore. My own nerves were shot, and I was jumping at every noise outside my apartment. We agreed she'd go through Alara Swift for updates unless it was a real emergency. The next day, I noticed a dark sedan behind me on my way to work. I took a different route to the grocery store that afternoon and saw what looked like the same car 3 cars back. On my way home, I made 4 random turns, and the sedan stayed with me the whole time. I could only make out part of the license plate before it turned off at a red light. Officer Thorne ran the partial plate, but said it came back to a rental company. The rental place claimed they had no current contract on that car, which meant another dead end. Meanwhile, Jeremy started posting on Facebook about how men were always assumed guilty these days. He wrote long posts about false accusations, ruining innocent lives without ever mentioning names. His friends jumped in with comments about crazy ex-girlfriends and attention seekers trying to destroy good men. The post got shared dozens of times, and I watched the narrative shift in real time. People who didn't know the real story started taking his side and calling Naomi names in the comments. I hadn't slept more than 3 hours straight in 2 weeks, and it was destroying my ability to focus. My eyes burned from checking the locks every hour and scanning the parking lot before leaving my apartment. I missed an important deadline at work because I couldn't concentrate long enough to finish the project. My boss docked my pay, and I lost part of the monthly bonus I desperately needed for bills. The exhaustion made me sloppy, and I started making stupid mistakes I never would have made before. Alara Swift finally connected me with a counselor who worked on a sliding scale for people who couldn't afford regular therapy rates. The counselor specialized in helping people deal with stalking situations and actually understood what we were going through. Alara also mentioned a legal clinic downtown that helped people prepare for testimony without charging thousands in lawyer fees. Having actual resources instead of just pamphlets felt like the first real help we'd gotten in weeks. The counselor's office was in a strip mall between a nail salon and a tax place. Nothing fancy, but at least it was private. She had me sit in this old leather chair while she pulled out a yellow legal pad and asked me to start from the beginning. Not the emotional parts, but just the facts of what I saw at the restaurant. My hands were shaking as I went through each detail. How Jeremy grabbed Naomi's wrist, knocked over the water glass, trapped her against the wall, and she kept stopping me to write down specific phrases I could use in court that stuck to observable actions instead of interpretations. We spent 20 minutes just on breathing exercises because apparently most witnesses forget to breathe on the stand and pass out or panic, so she had me practice taking slow breaths between each piece of testimony while imagining the courtroom full of people staring at me. She gave me this worksheet to fill out at home with bullet points of everything I witnessed. No opinions or assumptions, just pure facts like a security camera would record them. 3 days later, Naomi called me crying because Jeremy had finally been served with the restraining order papers at his gym, and within 10 minutes her phone exploded with 47 text messages from different numbers, all him using burner apps to get around her blocking him. She screenshot every single message before deleting them, these long rants about how she was ruining his life, destroying his reputation, how everyone at the gym was looking at him like he was some kind of monster, mixed with declarations of love and promises to change if she just gave him one more chance. The messages got worse as the day went on, shifting from begging to threats about what would happen if she didn't drop the charges, how he knew where she worked, where her parents lived, where she got coffee every morning. Something feels off about Jeremy knowing exactly when to disappear every time the process server shows up. Makes me wonder if someone's tipping him off or if he's got cameras watching his own place. The timing seems too perfect to be luck. Officer Thorne added it all to the file as evidence of violating the no contact order, but said unless Jeremy showed up in person person, there wasn't much they could do about digital harassment. The next week, I was leaving work late because of inventory, and when I got to the parking lot, Jeremy's car was parked 3 spaces from mine, with him just sitting there watching me through his windshield. My whole body went cold as I fumbled for my phone, started recording video while backing toward the building, and called 911 saying there was a man violating a restraining order in my workplace parking lot. He must have seen me on the phone because he started his car and drove away slowly, making sure I saw him smile and wave as he passed. The cops showed up 15 minutes later and seemed annoyed that he was already gone, taking my statement with this tired expression like they'd heard it all before, while I showed them the video that mostly just showed headlights and a license plate. The officer said they'd add it to the file, but without him actually approaching me or making threats, it was hard to prove intent to harm versus coincidental presence in a public space. Naomi was falling apart by this point, missing work because she was too scared to leave her apartment, checking her windows every 5 minutes, jumping whenever her phone buzzed even though she'd changed her number twice already. She came over one night with a bottle of wine, and halfway through it started talking about just dropping everything, moving back with her parents in another state, letting Jeremy think he won if it meant getting her life back. I didn't try to convince her either way, just repeated what the counselor had told me about how safety plans work whether someone pursues legal action or not, how dropping charges doesn't always make stalkers stop. Sometimes it makes them feel empowered to escalate. She slept on my couch that night because she was too scared to go home alone, and in the morning said she'd think about it for a few more days before deciding. That afternoon, I got an email from Jeremy with the subject line, apology, that started with him saying he was sorry for any misunderstanding, but quickly turned into accusations about me being a paid actor in Naomi's scheme to destroy him. He claimed he had proof I'd been hired to lie, that the $300 was just the beginning of what Naomi had paid me, that he was going to sue both of us for defamation unless I admitted the truth and refused to testify. The email ended with him saying he knew where I worked, where I lived, what car I drove, and that lies had consequences people never saw coming. I forwarded it to Officer Thorne without responding, and she called within an hour, saying this was good evidence for the case, but to vary my routines and consider staying with friends for a while. 2 weeks later, the court date arrived and we sat in that hallway for 3 hours watching other cases get called, while my stomach churned and Naomi chewed her fingernails down to nothing. When they finally called us, the courtroom was smaller than I expected, just a regular room with wood paneling and uncomfortable benches. I took the stand and tried to remember the breathing exercises while the prosecutor asked me to describe what I witnessed, sticking to my bullet points about Jeremy's physical actions at the restaurant. Then Jeremy's lawyer stood up and immediately started attacking my credibility, asking why I accepted money to watch a private conversation, suggesting I was either Naomi's friend pretending to be a stranger or a hired actress playing a role. The judge interrupted to ask me directly about the $300, whether I knew Naomi before that day, whether we'd discussed what I should say in court, and I could feel everyone in the room judging me as I explained it was just wrong place, wrong time, and I needed the money. Jeremy sat there in his suit looking calm and professional, nothing like the man who'd grabbed Naomi's wrists or stalked me in parking lots, occasionally shaking his head sadly like he was the real victim here. After 2 more hours of testimony and arguments, the judge finally ruled that the pattern of contact and escalation showed a credible threat, extending Naomi's protective order for a full year, despite Jeremy's lawyer immediately saying they'd appeal. Jeremy stood up so fast his chair fell over, stormed out while his lawyer scrambled to gather papers and chase after him, and even though we'd technically won it felt hollow, because we all knew a piece of paper wouldn't stop someone that determined. Within hours, my social media was flooded with messages from accounts I didn't recognize, calling me a liar, a gold digger, a homewrecker, saying I'd destroyed an innocent man's life for money. Some messages included screenshots from my LinkedIn showing where I worked, photos grabbed from my Instagram before I made it private, even my mom's Facebook page with threats to expose what kind of person raised such a lying daughter. I spent the entire night locking down every account, reporting harassment, filing complaints with platforms that didn't care, watching my online presence get destroyed by strangers who'd never met me, but believed Jeremy's version of events. Naomi found a sublet through Alara's Advocate Network, a furnished studio in a security building 40 minutes away, where the landlord was used to renting to people fleeing domestic situations and didn't ask questions. She packed just clothes and essentials into her car, left everything else in a storage unit, and gave her new address only to me, Alara, and her parents, not even telling her employer the specific location, just the general area. The move cost her almost $2,000 between deposits, storage fees, and gas, money she didn't have but couldn't afford not to spend, because staying meant waiting for Jeremy to escalate from digital stalking to showing up at her door. I started changing everything about my daily routine, never taking the same route to work twice, shopping at different stores, going to the gym at random times, installing new deadbolts and a security bar for my door. My credit card maxed out buying cameras for every angle of my apartment, motion sensor lights, a loud personal alarm, pepper spray, even a baseball bat I kept by my bed and in my car. The $300 from that first day was long gone, replaced by over $1,500 in security expenses I couldn't afford, but couldn't live without, learning the hard way that fear has a price tag nobody tells you about when you agree to help a stranger. My phone buzzed Thursday morning with a text from a number I didn't recognize, just a photo of my apartment building taken from across the street with my window circled in red marker. No words, no threats, just proof someone had been watching me yesterday while I was home, and the protective order only covered Naomi, which meant I had zero legal protection from whatever Jeremy wanted to do. I went straight to the police station and filed my own harassment report, but the officer behind the desk explained that without explicit threats or actual violence, this was a civil matter at best. She added notes to their system about the photo and said it would help establish a pattern if things escalated, but right now their hands were tied, which made me want to scream because waiting for escalation meant waiting to get hurt. Back at my apartment, I ran into Lysander Stowe, my upstairs neighbor who worked nights at the hospital, and he mentioned seeing the same dark sedan parked on our street at weird hours for the past week. He said he'd already talked to Officer Thorne about it. When the cop came by asking questions, questions, and having someone else notice the surveillance made me feel less crazy, even though it still wasn't enough for criminal charges. That night, I checked Jeremy's social media using a fake account and found post after post about being betrayed, about truth coming to light, about people getting what they deserved, all vague enough that his friends were commenting support and prayers without knowing the real story. The scariest part was how he mixed these dark posts with normal stuff about work and sports, maintaining just enough normalcy that nobody saw the danger building underneath. Naomi called through Alara the next morning because she'd found metal screws positioned perfectly behind her back tires in her building's garage, placed to cause slow leaks instead of immediate flats, which made it almost impossible to prove someone did it on purpose. She filed another police report that got added to the growing pile of incidents that weren't quite criminal enough to matter, each one too small on its own, but together painting a picture of someone systematically trying to break us down. Alara arranged a three-way call where we discussed Naomi potentially moving out of state to stay with her sister, but she couldn't afford to leave her job without something else lined up first. The advocate explained that most stalking victims can't just disappear and start over like in movies, because bills don't stop and employers don't hold positions indefinitely, so victims end up choosing between safety and survival, which isn't really a choice at all. We decided to route all our communication through Alara from that point forward, creating a professional buffer between us that made everything feel more manageable, even though it meant giving up direct contact completely. I'd text Alara updates about anything suspicious, she'd pass relevant info to Naomi, and Naomi would do the same in reverse, turning our friendship into a game of telephone, but at least reducing the daily stress of wondering if each message would somehow trigger Jeremy. 2 weeks passed without major incidents, but I still checked every lock 3 times before bed, scanned every parking lot before getting out of my car, and kept my phone recording whenever I walked anywhere alone. $300 turned into $1,500 in security costs. Naomi's calculator must be broken, because that's the worst return on investment since cryptocurrency crashed. The quiet didn't mean we were safe, just that Jeremy was either planning something bigger or temporarily distracted by work or friends. But either way, the hypervigilance was exhausting and impossible to turn off. Every car that drove slowly past my building made my heart race. Every unexpected knock had me grabbing my phone, and I started taking different routes home each day, even though it added 20 minutes to my commute. Alara called on a Tuesday afternoon to tell me Naomi had found a note taped to her apartment door that morning saying, "You made me do this," in Jeremy's handwriting, and she'd immediately called 911. The police arrested Jeremy for violating the protective order, but he was released the same day with a court date set for 3 weeks later, the whole system acting like a revolving door that kept spitting him back out no matter what he did. Within hours of his release, messages started arriving from his friends and even his mom, all wanting to hear our side or offering to mediate what they called a misunderstanding. I blocked each number without responding, finally understanding that engaging with any of them just fed the drama and gave Jeremy more ammunition to claim we were the aggressors. His mom left 3 voicemails saying she knew her son had issues, but that we were making things worse by involving police, as if we were the problem for wanting to be safe. One of his friends even showed up at my work asking the receptionist if I was available to talk about the situation with Jeremy, which got him escorted out by security, but showed how far Jeremy's influence reached. The friend had seemed genuinely concerned, like he thought he was helping, which made it scarier because it meant Jeremy was still controlling the narrative with everyone who mattered to him. Each person who reached out thought they were being reasonable, offering to help resolve what they saw as a relationship dispute, not understanding they were being used as weapons in Jeremy's campaign of harassment. Silence became my only defense, refusing to engage or explain or justify why I'd helped a stranger that day at the restaurant, because any response would just loop back to Jeremy and fuel his obsession. The apartment listings blurred together on my laptop screen, each one more expensive than the last, but I kept scrolling because staying in my old place meant Jeremy knew exactly where I lived. My savings account showed just enough for first month plus deposit on a place 40 minutes from work instead of my current 10-minute walk. I printed out 3 applications and filled them out at the kitchen table, my hand cramping from writing the same information over and over. The landlord at the third place, a converted warehouse with security cameras and a doorman, called back within hours. I signed the lease that afternoon, not even trying to negotiate the rent that would eat up 60% of my paycheck. When I told Adora about needing time off to move, she shifted my schedule around without asking questions, letting me work early mornings and late evenings to pack during the day. She couldn't give me more money, but she gave me what flexibility she could. I rented a truck and moved everything myself over 3 trips, my back screaming by the end, because hiring movers meant more strangers knowing where I lived. 2 weeks later, I sat in the courthouse waiting room, watching the clock tick toward Jeremy's hearing time. Naomi sat 3 chairs down, both of us pretending not to know each other on the prosecutor's advice. The bailiff called Jeremy's case number and we filed into the courtroom. Jeremy stood at the defendant's table in a suit that made him look like a banker, not someone who'd terrorized 2 strangers. The prosecutor read the charges, and Jeremy's lawyer immediately started talking about first offenses and anger management. Within 20 minutes, they'd worked out a deal where Jeremy pled to disorderly conduct, got 18 months probation, and had to attend weekly counseling. The judge asked if there were any victim impact statements, and both Naomi and I stayed silent because speaking would just give Jeremy more ammunition. He paid his $500 fine right there in cash and walked out of the courthouse a free man with just some paperwork to deal with. 3 days after moving into my new place, a dark sedan slowed to a crawl outside my window. My whole body went rigid, heart hammering, sweat breaking out instantly. I pressed myself against the wall, peeking through the blinds, watching the car inch forward. The driver leaned out, checking house numbers, then pulled into a driveway 2 houses down, just someone visiting a neighbor. My legs shook so bad I had to sit on the floor, waiting for my breathing to slow down. This happened almost daily now, my body reacting to normal things like they were threats. Car doors slamming made me jump. Footsteps behind me made me walk faster. My nervous system couldn't tell the difference between real danger and regular life anymore. Alara texted me a screenshot from Naomi 2 months after the hearing. Naomi was seeing a therapist twice a week, back at her job but taking different routes to work every day, still looking over her shoulder in parking lots. The message said she was managing, getting better slowly, learning to feel safe again. We were both functioning, showing up to work, paying bills, going through the motions of normal life held together by therapy appointments and constant watchfulness. 6 months after that day in the restaurant, the $300 bills still sat in my desk drawer, crisp and untouched. I'd pulled them out a dozen times to buy groceries or pay for gas, but always put them back. If someone asked me to help again, I'd probably say yes, but I'd ask more questions first, set clearer rules about what I could and couldn't do. The fear lived in my body permanently now, a constant low hum of alertness. But underneath it was something else, the knowledge that when someone needed help, I didn't run. Thanks for listening to me wonder about all this today. It's been really interesting exploring these questions with you. Until next time, stay curious. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.